Okay, we'll start in a couple minutes. We've still got a lot of people joining, so we'll probably start right around 7:03, 7:05. We've got some quilters,
Yeah.
some history lovers, some students. My mom just joined. Hi, Mom. This is great. There's Sherry. Hi, Sherry. All right. And I'm just muting everybody as they come in, just to make it, just to cut down on the.
Yeah, I'll unmute myself when just before Pat speaks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll mute myself as well, so that way Pat will stay up on the screen the whole time. Oh, and some people are saying hello in the chat. Okay. Oops.
It's 7:02.
All right, I think we're ready to go. We've got a bunch of people on. I'm sure a few more will join in the next few minutes. But I think we can get started.
I'll be admitting people so we can start.
Yeah, if you keep admitting people while I introduce tonight's program, that's great. All right. Welcome to the Rye Historical Society. I'm Allison Relier, and I wanted to thank you all for joining us at the Rye Historical Society this evening. We heard about Patricia A. Montgomery's work from Teresa Vega, who some of you might remember from our film screening in December. Thank you, Teresa, for the introduction. I fell in love with Patricia A. Montgomery's swing coats and the stories they tell as soon as I saw them. This event has drawn interest from a range of community members, from quilters and other artists to history lovers, local students, and activists. And after the presentation, we will have time for a Q&A on all of these topics. First, a bit about the artist. Patricia A. Montgomery is a textile and installation artist. Her artwork focuses on African-American historical and mythical stories. Her research into her rich African-American past feeds her stories. Modified traditional quilting patterns, bright West African fabrics, and batiks are her canvas, and all kinds of threads are her paints. Mixed together, she creates textile paintings rich in color and texture that celebrate the rhythms of life. Patricia A. Montgomery's historical story quilts transformed into a swing coat, each coat representing an individual from the civil rights movement. These swing coats tell the stories of unknown heroines and their major contribution to the most important movement of the 20th century. Now she is known as the Coat Lady. Montgomery has exhibited nationally and internationally. She was born in Biloxi, Mississippi, and raised in Hempstead, New York until 1979. She currently resides in Oakland, California. Thanks to Zoom, we can welcome Patricia A. Montgomery to our Rye community this evening and learn about her art through her storytelling. And now Teresa is going to say a couple quick words about Patricia as well. So handing it over to Teresa.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this very special presentation tonight. I am thrilled to be able to present my friend Patricia Montgomery. We've known each other a couple of decades right now. As the former president of Quilters of Color Network of New York, Patricia was part of our guild, so there are plenty of people in the chat room who know her from there. Patricia was one of many quilters who immediately made an impression on me. She gave me permission to what we call play, to use mixed media. And as I sit in my studio, I'm remembering so many times Pat would come over here and we would just have play dates where we created. So I am thrilled that she has been in the spotlight for a while now, and then I can share her with the world and with the Rye Historical Society and audience. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Patricia, and you can see how what she's been up to and the messages that she is conveying on these heroes and heroines of the civil rights movement. Patricia, you're on.
Oh, one thing very quickly. If people put questions in the chat, then I'll keep track of those questions. And when we go to the Q&A, we'll have the questions all ready to go. So if something comes to mind, just put it in the chat. And after the presentation's over, then we'll have some time to talk about individual questions. So thank you. And we're going to mute everybody except for Patricia for the presentation. Thanks. All right, go ahead, Patricia. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to my chat about my civil rights movement swing coats. A little background behind these particular coats is that it was the spring of 2013. My girlfriend and I, we decided to apply for the Creative Work Fund grant. So I decided that I should design something, came up with the concept of designing quilts and then turning them into swing coats to tell a story of these individuals. The first individual that I get an opportunity to talk about and design the coat for was Diane Nash. Now, mind you, I had been sewing since I was 16 years old, and I knew how to make a garment and everything, but designing these coats was a new challenge for me. Diane Nash, after attending a nonviolence civil obedience workshop led by Reverend James Lawson, Nash becomes the leader of the lunch counter sit-ins in Nashville for 4 months. One day, she asked the Nashville mayor, Ben West, "Do you feel it is wrong to discriminate against a person solely on the basis of their race or color?" He didn't really answer at the time, and on May 10th, 1960, Nashville, Tennessee became the first Southern city to desegregate lunch counters. Her next successful civil rights movement campaign was the Freedom Riders during the spring of 1961. And this campaign was designed to test the federal court's desegregation interstate travel law. Whenever I design something, I create the entire background first. And one of the things that I do in order to create the composition is I do all the digital images on paper. And that gives me my scale. It helps me understand where everything is going to be and how much or how big I need to print it when I do it into fabric, since I'm only doing this on an 8x11 sheet of paper. So in this particular design for the back of her coat, I used the lunch counter story. And so I put the lunch counter in, but the mirrors show how all of the students, when they were sitting at the counter, is being abused. Things are thrown on them, etc. But yet they do not, fight back in any way. And to the right on this coat, there's a sign that indicates
what's up?
only cater to white folks.
Oh, you did?
Another known step I was using, especially during—
Can you please mute yourselves?
Another known step that I was using a lot of, another was writing my stories into my coats. I wrote them in with my handwriting and felt that this was a great way for people to move up to the coats and really take an opportunity to read the story that would invite them in. And as you can see from the machine quilting on the back, I am a very unorthodox quilter in the sense that my quilting stitch is more of a doodle of many colors of threads coming together to create the surface. When I did Diane Nash's piece, I actually added seed stitches in her purse and also did that type of stitch in her hair, just to give her a little more depth and dimension. In the beginning, I was talking about how I had been sewing since I was 18 and I knew how to actually put a garment together. But this coat offered new challenges to me because all of the sections of the coat were thick. They had now the top batting and muslin on the bottom, and I had to put them all together and sew them together. So we came to the setting of the sleeves, and I could not set the sleeves. I spent all day long trying to figure out how to do this. I was determined I was going to do it. So me and the seam ripper became very good friends that day. By the end of the day, I had figured out a technique to do it and had to remember every time that I created a coat to make sure I left seam allowances, because I sewed everything all the way to the edge, which made it nearly impossible to put together the first time around. And here is her finished coat with all the elements in it. And one of the other elements that you'll see throughout all of my coats are the buttons and, of course, the cuffs. I had so much trouble with the cuffs that every coat I put together, I would always have to redo the cuffs because I had put them in backwards initially. Daisy Bates. Daisy Bates pushed for racial equality in Arkansas and played a vital role as a driving force behind the Little Rock Nine, who integrated into the all-white Central High School. The Bates home became a safe haven for the Little Rock Nine. Now, she had a very large picture window for her living room. And throughout all of this, her window would get busted, crashed, all kinds of things would be thrown at her window. But she refused to board the entire window up. And so her window becomes very symbolic and very much a part of the design of her coat. And in this particular site, I started designing the window. And I was thinking when I was designing it, how I could emulate sections in it where it was was destroyed by something or rock being thrown into the window. Eventually, after I finished drawing it all out and using my pencils and everything, I cut the canvas pieces out and used organza to create the actual window on the back of her coat so that you could see through the window. And as you can see here, I took all of the Little Rock Nine images of Little Rock Nine and digitized them onto fabric and put them in the window. Now, the Little Rock Nine met at Daisy Bates' house every day, and they were escorted to school through by the Army 101 Airborne Division. And they studied nonviolent techniques and everything in her home, besides being a part of this house being a safe haven for them. Another really interesting thing that happened with this particular coat was I bought this fabric from this store in San Francisco. I mean, it's like the top-notch fabric store. And I brought it home and it was so soft and I thought it was really beautiful fabric and everything. And when I started to quilt it, I didn't realize it had a nap on it. So all my stitches were sinking and I had to immediately learn how to figure out how to raise the stitches up. And so I end up putting a great deal of stitch work in this particular quilt, which made it even more heavier. And then of course, now I've started to do all of my text through the computer and printing them into the fabric and sewing them into the coat. So here's a picture of the back of the coat, the detail of it, showing how the window works and becomes symbolic for this particular coat in her story. And of course, I always design the collar and the buttons. And when I finish most of my coats or get to the finishing part of it, I hang them on the dress form just to be sure this is the right color button, this is the right color cuff, everything before I completely finish it. And here is the finished product of the coat. She was the youngest to walk the hall, Carletta Walls. She was the youngest Negro student for integrating the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and a part of the Little Rock Nine. She endured being kicked, pushed, spit upon, verbally abused every day, and was always escorted by armed guards to class. She never fought back. And the desire to get a good education was her legal right, according to Brown versus the Board of Education. She does graduate from Little Rock Central High School in 1960. Her coat is designed on Italian wool. This fabric was so beautiful. And I used various and many shapes from my batiks and African fabrics to create an abstract border on the bottom of her coat. And this is the first steps in my designing of her particular coat. With every coat, like I said, I do create the story, but I create the story first on paper. I've wanted to find something personal about her to tell a story about. For me, it was the story about her parents deciding to buy her a store-bought dress. And you have to remember, in those days, African Americans didn't go into the boutique or dress shop or Sears and Roebuck or any of those shops to buy clothing. And most of the time, the clothing were made. But her parents wanted her to have a store-bought dress. So the dress becomes very symbolic to me. And at first, I wanted to just draw the dress in and played around with some ideas and buttons and really didn't like it. And eventually I find a digital image of a dress that I would like to use, and I added it to the composition itself. The dress, which is here, is also in the African American Museum and Library in San Francisco. I mean, not in San Francisco, in Washington, D.C. today. This is one of the coats where I turned back around and used. She was created in the first wave of all of the coats. As I worked on these coats throughout the years, the technique and style and things change with many ways I've learned to do certain things. She was done in the first wave where I wrote all of my texts for the stories in the coats. And of course, I was able to find a button that matched not only the fabric itself, but even had some of the colors of the batiks in the button. And here's her finished coat.
To me, at least.
The Bloody Sunday event led to the passing of the Voters' Rights Act in 1965. Amelia Bolton Robinson. I was one of the key figures who helped organize the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama for voting rights. On March 7, 1965, 600 protests led by John Lewis marched on the Edward Petty's Bridge over the Alabama River into Selma. The protesters were attacked by policemen with tear gases and billy clubs. A newspaper photograph of my beaten, unconscious body laid on the bridge drew national attention. This event became known as Bloody Sunday. The march from Selma to Montgomery was completed on March 24, 1965, with federal protection, and President Lyndon B. Johnson on August 6, 1965, signed the Voters' Rights Act. For her coat, I wanted very much to use that photograph that I just spoke about of her unconscious body laying on the ground. But since I could not get the rights for that particular photograph, I decided to use the bridge instead. When I was designing this bridge, cutting it out and figuring all the pieces and the parts of it, the television was on. And this was the year Selma comes out, the movie Selma comes out. And I look over and who is on the television screen but Comet singing a song standing on the Edward Petty's bridge. And I felt that that was such a sign since I was sitting here putting this bridge together piece by piece and making it work. Another design element that I always use too, that I put into my work are ghost images. I think ghost images are real important because they're subtle enough to where it forces your viewer to move close enough to see what is in it. What is it about? Why did she put that there? And it makes them come in closer to the work. And in this particular bridge, the ghost image is of Petty's Bridge, but with people marching across it. And by now, I'm starting more and more to use my text through the computer and type it out and attach it to fabric into the coat. Another interesting design element I threw within this coat was designing the sleeves. And as you can see, there are yellow, dark gray stripes along that sleeve. All of that work is thread. It's all needlework. And it's all thread machine quilted on top of each other to create those stripes. And of course, I use the coat sections to cut out all the lining in this particular coat because I had used yellow. I used the yellow orange fabric to create the lining throughout. As always, I design the collars and cuffs and add in this particular coat, I added ribbon in it as well and my signature buttons. This is the back of her coat, already and completed, and it shows how the lining becomes an integral part as well as another line within the design of it. Annie Mooney. Annie Mooney writes a book titled Coming of Age in Mississippi. It is the first person account describing the inequalities suffered by African Americans in rural Mississippi. Moody realized at age 15 that she could be killed for the color of her skin after learning about the murder of Emmett Till. That instilled fear in her. There's a wonderful story in her book how her and her girlfriend are a part of a protest. They're going to go to a march and demonstration march. And her girlfriend and her, they put on all these layers of clothes. So in case they are arrested, they will be worn while they're in jail. And so she becomes a very active member in all of the civil rights organizations of the day. She's a part of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Coalition of Racial Equality. And she also helped plan the 1964 Freedom Summer. At the end of her memoir, she reflected on the events and the many things that she had seen throughout the movement. And she remembered the words of the movement's anthem, "We shall overcome, we shall overcome, we shall overcome someday." And she paused. And the last sentence in her story is, "I wonder," she wrote, "I really wonder." When I decided to design her photograph, I found this computer program to where if you put in all words and everything, and you put in what you want it to be, the words would appear in her portrait. So her portrait really tells a story about her coming of age, her being a part of NAACP, CORE, and everything. And all of these are indicated within the portrait of her. By the time I designed this coat, I had just received a embroidery sewing machine. It is something that I've always wanted to do. And so I experimented on this coat and used the embroidery machine to create the text. And it's the first time that I did it. And also I used a design to add splash to the cuffs and the collar. And as you can see, you can tell this is my first time doing all of these. The text, because I got a little crazy about it and I used all different styles and everything, and the coming of age and so forth throughout the front. Of course, designing her collar, I always drape the fabric on the dress form and I add the buttons to it to make sure that they are going to work and they're the right style. Another design element that came into this coat was I added the trim here that, that became a part of it. And here's her finished coat. And you can see her face, the portrait of her face, but in order for anyone to really understand what's in her face in the text, they would have to move up closer to see it. And the rest of the elements are a lot easier to read. You know, her organization she was a part of, how she grew up in the South, etc. Septina Clark is an educator and a civil rights activist. Since many states use literacy tests to discourage African Americans to vote, she traveled throughout the Deep South training teachers through citizenship workshops. Her work at the Highland Folk School in Tennessee was legendary. She believed that knowledge could empower African Americans in ways that formal equality couldn't. This was an important role for the drive of voters' rights during the Civil Rights Movement. She becomes a part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Director of Education and Teacher, the first woman to gain a position on the executive board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But like many women, she struggled against the sexism in the movement. Women were treated unequally, and she felt it was one of the greatest weaknesses of the civil rights movement. Her coat is designed using a lot of the fabric that I used in Carolina Wall's coat, except I created the shape so they ran up and down and not across and around in the coat. When I'm doing the back of her coat, as you can see, I have the fronts laid out as well as the back. So when I'm connecting the fabrics, they'll all connect when I sew it together and it'll be one shape. And this is a detail of some of my quilting. Later on, as I continue to quilt, I don't use as many color threads, but I was still in the beginning using a lot of different colors. So even though you can't see the darker colors, you can see all of the lighter ones where I was in this area of the coat, sewing upward and outward. For her, I decided to use text as the main element of the design and talk about her accomplishments and the things she did throughout her time involved with the civil rights movement and teaching. And I used a lot of text where I was able to change the text to be vertical and some to be horizontal and everything, which added the variety in the design across the back of her coat. And here's the finished front with a picture of the Highland Folk School. And this is the back of her coat that was completed. That's the completed element. Pauline Murphy. Even though I was denied entry into Harvard University because of my gender, I will become the first African American to receive a law degree from Yale Law School in 1965. I will serve as a lawyer arguing civil and women's rights cases for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The publish of an article titled Jane Crow and the Law, Sexual Discrimination And Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was her
Up and saw the shadow of a man standing
writing
a
the
few
book
feet back.
about Jane Crow.
The only exit from my office.
Jane Crow was the gender version of Jim Crow, which was the racial segregation in the southern states. She believed that the Negro woman could no longer postpone or not fight against discrimination because of sex to the civil rights struggle, but had to fight for both of them simultaneously. Her coat is designed all on Black fabric, and I use a lot of different cut-up shapes in red and Black. Across the back of the coat, that goes across the front and on one side. I sew with a straight stitch sewing machine, and if anyone has ever taken a workshop from me, they know I'm always in telling them, put the foot down on the pedal, push, push. It comes from me using this machine, which shows 1,500 stitches in a minute, and I definitely do hit the pedal to the metal when I'm quilting. So that's an image of that machine. Now, I have finally learned not only to design with thread more, but I finally learned how to do the embroidery text where it now appears in sentence format with little spacing and using one font design in order to do it. And so her coat has this text throughout. And it's mostly on the front of the coat as well as the sleeves. And you can see here on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, the stitch work that was done over all of these shapes that I had actually put in the coat. And finally, here is an image of the coat laying on my work table with everything completed. The lining is there, and I use a reddish pink batik. I use bright red with dark red buttons on it, and it's all completely finished. And here is how it looks in this exhibit that was in South Carolina. The last coat I will talk about is about Ella Josephine Baker. Ellen Josephine Baker was a professional community organizer and believed in group-centered leadership, which allowed people to participate in the decisions that affected their lives. Her philosophy developed and encouraged leadership throughout the leading civil rights movement organizations and the African American community. This is an image of me starting to lay out all of the fabric, and I used the folk pattern from Simplicity, and it's used for every coat within this series. It's the same pattern, and this is an image of me laying out and cutting out her coat the first time. Now, as many of you saw, there are all different types of shapes and everything I have within all of my coats and use. This particular coat had all diamond shapes. And even though today they have all these nice fabulous cutters, electric cutters and machines, I was doing this still with a rotary cutter and a ruler. So I would sit and cut through yards of different types of fabrics to get all these diamond shapes so that when I got ready to fuse them onto the surface, I'd have everything ready. So this is me starting to add these shapes onto this fabric because I wasn't very pleased about using just this stark bright orange by itself. And I added the coat, all of those diamond shapes travel up the back of her coat, and in the front of her coat, it comes like in a diamond shape to a shape that comes to the bottom of her coat. And you can see here, especially, you can see the quilting stitch that I call my dueling stitch that I sew with and create the texture and the movement with the needle and all the various colors of threads that I do use and put to work. When I thought about designing her coat, I decided that I was going to use symbolically the door. And the door is very symbolic to me, and I've used it before in other pieces of my art, but never really in a piece that I exhibit. So her door, the door I designed, shows the door opening, and it looks like we're going out into a cloud, into the sky. And the main reason for that is that I felt that through all of the things that she talked about throughout her story about people being their own leader and everything, I thought about it in the sense of open the door, walk through it, and change the world. Because in many ways, she was changing the world. She changed the world by training others to be leaders. And so symbolically to me, this door image was important. So of course I created it with oil pastels and did the stitch work on top of it and added the text and the story in text. And here is her completed coat. And the saying that she talks about leaders becoming leaders, I put it on the other side of her coat. And the buttons on this particular coat, I actually got when I was in New York the last time and never used them. And when I made this coat, they were perfect for it. Thank you so very much. That's the end. Time for questions.
All right, I'm unmuting myself. And Teresa, you're unmuted now as well, correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so we have some, thank you so much. First of all, those are so beautiful. And loved the stories. I just want to learn so much more about each of the women who you've designed a coat for. And I am looking in the chat and there's a bunch of questions. I'm going to start with the question, why the swing coat shape?
I use the swing coat shape because first of all, it's my favorite coat. That's number one. Any woman can wear a swing coat and she looks gorgeous in it. But for me, in this particular aspect of this, designing these coats, it became a bigger surface for me to be able to tell the story and to design it so that people could see the story. That was one of the reasons why.
Great. And then a lot of the questions are about the quilting technique. So is there a particular reason that you use contrasting thread in the quilting?
A lot of times it was just so I could see the texture. I'm really into being able to see the push and pull of the rhythm of the colors running throughout the entire fabric. So if I did use contrasting threads, it was to add that push and pull. I come from a painter background and I painted for a long time abstract paintings. So it traveled into my quilting, but through the thread use of me creating push and pull and rhythm throughout. Whenever you see the coats in real life, you can see that rhythm. You know, it's harder to see it in a digital image, but it is definitely seeable when you see the actual pieces.
All right, so let's see. I think it's so interesting that you chose to focus on the women members of the civil rights movement. And I'd be curious to hear how meaningful it has been for you to share their stories. What impact have they had on you? So do you want
Okay.
some connection to the women who you quilted about?
Okay. The one reason why I ended up using women of the civil rights movement was I was in the library. I'm a library person. I go to the library and walk through the stacks. I enjoy that more than going through the card catalog and so forth. I found this book, and the title of the book was Huron's Untold Stories of Women in the Civil Rights Movement. At the time, I took the book home with me, and I kind of glanced through it and everything. And of course, it was due back, and I took it back to the library. And I never thought about it until I decided to apply for the Creative Work Fund grant. Then I thought about it and said, wow, what would it be like to do research on these women and tell their story? It had a profound effect to me because of the fact that even though I was probably old enough to be involved in the civil rights movement, I grew up north. So it wasn't as, prevalent around me. And so I got to learn so very much about what the civil rights movement was all about. And it was truly about making it possible for people to have rights, to have the right to live in a good place, to have the right to have a good education, to be able to vote, to have a voice. Those were the things I really learned about from reading each woman's story. And I have 16 coats done of 16 different women, and each one, that is the prevailing story throughout. It's like, we're doing this so that it'll make someone else's life better. And I felt, and also too, when I think about it, even now, these stories are so important because without the civil, even though all of the men in the civil rights movement we know of, we know their names, we know who they are, what they did, you know, and everything, but we didn't know about all of these women. And these women and children were the backbone of the civil rights movement. There was another part of that. I didn't hear it all, Allison. Was there another part of that question?
No, I think you covered it. Yeah, and there's more, you know, you'll probably cover more of that in some of these other questions.
I have a question.
Yes.
I have a question. Patricia, you said you came from a quilting background, a painting background. What got you involved in quilting? I know you said you learned to sew early on, but why quilting as a method?
I got accepted into the Florence Biennale. And at the time I was in grad school painting 6 feet by 6 feet paintings, abstract paintings. And I knew I was not carrying them to Italy. And at the time I was trying to figure out what I can do and everything. And I had read about Faith Ringo moving from being the painter to doing quilts. And so I decided to do the same thing. I said, oh, I can make story quilts. I had no clue what a quilt was made up, how, or whatever. Of course, I go to the library again and get books out and read about it and give it a shot. And if you see behind me, even though the light is very bright, that is the first story quilt I created. And I used both image photographs of African-American women, and I put around them African-American fabric in a contemporary log cabin pattern, and did 3 of these quilts, packed them in a gem bag, and boarded the plane for Italy. They were a hit because they were the only textile in the entire show. So it was kind of nice in a way.
Thank you.
That's amazing. Such a great story for switching from one medium to another. And so speaking of exhibits, Jen Sandling asked, are the coats on exhibit? You mentioned an exhibit in the Carolinas, or are they in a book? And I think we're all waiting for the Civil Rights Swing Coat book to come out. So are they on exhibit right now?
There are 4 coats on exhibit in New York at a gallery in Soho named Black Wall. And in fact, the show opened yesterday, actually. And I will send you information, Teresa, so you can be able to go by and see it. I only have 4 of the coats in there. And in fact, Ella Josephine's Baker coat is in that exhibit, along with Amelia Bolton Robinson's coat. And I can't remember the other 2 coats that are in there, but they are on exhibit in New York. And the rest of them are in storage right now. I have all the rest of them in storage except for the one I'm presently working on.
Wow. That's great. So we can take a field trip to New York and see them. And someone, let's see, I've got, this one, I think I had this question as well. Chris Duncan asked, I noticed that each coat was a different color. Does the story bring you to that color for the coat? Or is it a certain fabric that draws you in and you go from there? Or
sometimes the fabric does do that. sometimes I decide that the fabric matches that person and that'll work, you know? Other times it's interesting because when I started these coats, one of the things that happened with being awarded this grant was I was allowed to buy all different types of fabric that I would have never used. And some of the fabric was even given to me, like, for example, Septina Clark's coat is made from fabric that was given to me. And the orange fabric, I believe I had it in my stash forever, and I took it out and said, oh, what can I do with this? So each person's coat, in some respects, it was that way, or I would take the fabric and hang it on the wall with the name of the person and leave it there for a while. And if it spoke to me, it was made. If it didn't, I had to go back to the drawing board.
Great. And then this one, these coats are so impactful. They should be on display in the Capitol buildings where these ladies lived. Do you have any coats from New York women?
No, I have actually, when I think about it, I have very few coats designed for people in the North. I finally moved up, and I think the last few coats I'm making I'm trying to get more of people in the northern part of the world because I was so in the South. And plus, I kept staying in Mississippi so much that I had to tell myself, you cannot do another person from Mississippi. That's out. And I would move on. So I guess symbolically, even though I never lived there, I kept wanting to create stories and coats from the women that were from Mississippi more than anywhere else.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I'm interested to learn about it's your last 4 coats. Is that right? How many have you finished?
I finished a total of 16 coats, and I have the design, the concept, part of the research done for 4 additional coats, and they just have not hit the drawing board. Some of them I've cut out the coats and attached fabric to them to see where I was going, but they never got there. The main coat that I'm really working on is Fannie Lou Hammer, which I had started when I initially started the entire project and never completed her coat. I've gotten a lot further in her coat, and I'm still working on the design of the story that's going to be on the back of her coat.
Patricia, speak on just your creative process. Like, you know, a lot of people do not realize how much research goes into a quilt. You know, I find with my own work, there's just a whole lot of research that in heart and soul that you put into this this work of art that you know, as artists who speak truth to power, there's just so much, every detail that it takes. I don't think the average person knows just how intentional our work is and the points that we're trying to make. Speak on that.
It's really interesting because I think the very first thing, because I commuted to San Francisco I was working a 40-hour job. I still work a 40-hour-a-week job. And at this time I was commuting back and forth to San Francisco. The very first thing I purchased was a Kindle. And the reason for that was I knew I would have to read about all of these women. And the majority of them I have read cover to cover books on each one. And when I got ready at one point, in the beginning, I would lay out all this fabric and I would cut out everybody's coat and I would design it with the name on the coat and put it and hang it all around the studio and work on this one, work on that one. But after a while, I started to really focus in on one coat at a time. And a lot of times I could not figure out how or what the story was going to be. A really great example is when I was designing the coat for, going blank, was a really good example when I was designing this particular coat. I couldn't think of the story. I didn't know what story to tell. I kept coming back. Dorothy Hyatt was Dorothy Hyatt. Now, Dorothy Hyatt lived a long life, and she was very much involved in the civil rights movement on all kinds of levels. Her book was great, reading her book from cover to cover, but I couldn't decide, what am I going to talk about? What kind of story can I tell about this woman? And because I kept thinking and wanting to keep something personal to do, so that when my viewers see this, at least it will encourage them or inspire them to learn more about that individual. So it was through a dream that I had about the very last chapter in the book, where she wanted to purchase this building, and the building turned out to be a building in Washington, D.C. on Pennsylvania Avenue that used to be a slave market. And now it's a building that teaches women to be leaders. It takes I draw out a lot of my designs and sketches. I write texts about them. I take a long time to come up with the concept. Once that's done, the rest of it is just work.
That's amazing that you've created all these quilts. It's really incredible. Back to the content. This is a great, really timely question. Your work covers so many different figures and has been coming together over such a long time. Do you find that your work has taken on new meaning in the last year with the centennial anniversary of female suffrage, the passing of John Lewis, and the summer BLM Black Lives Matter protests? I would love to hear your thoughts on this evolving narrative. And that's from Claire Killian.
Wow. It's funny. I was thinking about that this morning when I was hearing on the news, and we were talking about suppression and voters' rights and all these cases in the news about voting and what they need to do, how the Republicans are trying to stop that. And the thought came to me about how there were so many people that marched, died, injured, and everything for people to be able to vote. And then there's some people still there trying to take that away. Another aspect of all of this is every set of coats were done in different years. And because of that, my style and growth as an artist changed. And it wasn't until I saw the exhibit in South Carolina where all the coats were installed that I was able to really see the growth and development of my techniques and design compositions and everything, that I could see the growth that I had made in the development of this series. Regarding Black Lives Matter and all, I've already started a coat called Their Names, Say Their Names, and it's already in development. I just still have to do the embroidery of all the names on the coat, and I have already started that. So the coats, even though the civil rights movement is over here, I've started designing other coats to tell the stories in different ways. And so like I created already the coat to say their name. And I have an idea for a protest coat, which would be a little more personal because my nieces, I received a photograph of my nieces that were a part of Black Lives Matter, and we'll be able to add them into the coat itself when I eventually get to designing it.
Oh, I can't wait to see those coats. That's wonderful to do that, to have something that's directly in response. Next question, what artists inspire and inform your design choices? I think of Faith Ringgold a bit when I see some of the colors and patterns with the text. And that's from Margot Clark Junkins.
My creative ancestors really come from painting. It's Jackson Pollock and the color movement, rhythm, and the Impressionists for the softness of color and adding light. And there are some quilters that I really enjoy and see their work and would love to learn those types of technique. But most of the time, I stay and stick to the the creative part of me is always that painter, and that painter is what comes out with me using fabric and thread work.
Still so, yeah, I want to see some of your paintings now that I've learned about your evolution as an artist. I'm really interested to see the paintings that you did before the Biennale, before you went to Italy. I think it'd be really interesting to see how the quilts, reflect those, but have also taken on their own, life and direction. And then one question that I think, we know you're doing 20 coats, so you have a few more to do, and then you have the say their names coat. What other projects are in the works for you?
Before I go into that, I will say this much. If you like to see some of my past work, I do have a website called Dragon Art Place, and it shows my installation work as well as some of my paintings and so forth. That will give you a sense of what I've done in the past. And the civil rights codes are what are for the future work. And as you can see from my contact information, Dragon Art Place is indicated. So you should write that down and take some time to visit that site, that particular site. It does show all of that type of work. I'm in the process of
and I'll share.
Go ahead.
I'll share this with everyone. I can send a follow-up email to everyone who's registered, to share this information so that they can continue learning.
In one summer, a couple of years ago, I got invited to be in this show. And the show was all about the political issues surrounding Trump and everything. And I said, I am not doing anything about Trump. That was out of the question. I would not do that. And the curator kept talking to me about it. She really wanted me to create a code. So I decided to create a code on domestic violence. And I created this code, and I called it the wedding code. And so the wedding code talks about domestic violence, and the back of the code shows shows shadow figures of women, of particular women being abused. And it talks on the sleeves is all of the story about the words and how the words can hurt you, and what those negative words are throughout a domestic violence relationship. And the back of the code, the words and the text are about encouraging you for all of those women that walked away from domestic violence and became strong again and took back their powers. And so even though these shadow figures show all of the action of domestic violence, the real story is within those positive words. And so the wedding coat was exhibited in this show, and eventually I put it in the Pacific International Quilt Festival here in California, and it won Best in Show for that year. So I said, oh, I guess I'm on to something now. So I decided my last installation piece for Day of the Dead, which I had been doing since the 90s, and I got asked to do another installation. I created a wedding dress, and the wedding dress was had all of the words about domestic violence embroidered in the lace of the wedding dress, and she hung in the space. And even though you could walk up and you saw this beautiful gown, and it was a ball gown actually that I made, I will never use that much lace and tulle ever again. We learned these through the process. And the piece was named Baby Don't Hurt Me. And I put the saying on the wall. And all of a sudden you would see, when you walked up, you would see these very strong negative words about what was happening regarding domestic violence. And it was embroidered in the lace. And after that, I decided that I really want so much to move on and create a complete series about domestic violence using the wedding dress and using wedding apparel. Because one of the things that I really thought about a lot was when when you get married and you have on that beautiful wedding dress, it is the happiest moment of your life. But little do you know that that happiness could be destroyed with negativities and being harmed. And you are wondering what happened, what went wrong. But for just that brief moment, you're extremely happy because of this beautiful dress. And that's the symbolicness of me using the wedding dress and the wedding apparel for the newest series that I'm looking forward to produce.
That'll be really compelling. That's amazing. Let's see. Okay, we have one more question. Looking at the website, do you prefer the coats to be hung on the wall or on mannequins?
I have had them hung on the wall and I have had them on mannequins. And in fact, I own mannequins in order for me to take them to shows that I have here in California when I'm exhibiting them. But the very best place for the way that they are to be hung is really from the ceiling into the space. And the third show that all of the coats were in was at a gallery in Sacramento called the Brick House Complex. And it was a beautiful, wide open space. And the gallery owner climbed on these huge ladders to get up to the ceiling and drop that thread down, the cord down, so that we could tie the coats and the coats could be within the space itself. And when they are within the space, hanging from the ceilings in the space, it's like they have a whole new life to them. She used to say that when she came into the space, she felt that they were talking to each other. They moved within the space. It was like all of a sudden these women were being honored and their spirit came back within the coats and they were alive. And I can remember the night of the opening, the night before the opening, I had gone down there to stay and all, and I went to the reception and I was just like floored. The one thing that is awesome for any artist is to really see their work exhibit in the manner that they visualize it. When I created these coats, that was the way I had visualized them being in the space, hanging from the ceiling into the space itself, so people could walk around them, be a part of them, interact with them. And when I saw that exhibit, I went back to my hotel and I think I cried for several hours because I could not believe that I had made that happen, and to really see that kind of energy and power from art itself within its space. So that's the best way to hang them.
Thank you. That might answer this next question, although I still think we'd like to hear your thoughts on it. Do you make these coats with the intent that one day you will wear them, or are they for exhibit only?
They are actually for exhibit only. They are, unless you live, well, wait a minute, let me back that up a minute. If you lived in Chicago, you could wear them. They are extremely heavy because of all of the stitch work and the many layers. One of the things I use to stabilize the entire coat is canvas and to hold the stitch work so that it doesn't roll up and everything. So you add that plus batting, plus back muslin, plus a lining fabric, and that's a lot of fabric, and it is very, very heavy. The coats are very heavy, and in fact, when they're shipped, I have to actually lay them out flat for them to be shipped when they go to their various locations for exhibits and stuff. Me and the FedEx person here in Oakland, she knows my coats automatically. She knows exactly how to pack them when I take them in.
That's great. That's who you need, those people to, just to help everything run smoothly. That's great. Do you have anything else? Or does anyone have any other questions? I've gone through the questions in the chat, but I'll open it up in case there's people who have questions. Just if you have one, put it in the chat, and otherwise I'll see if we have any other final thoughts. I'm so inspired. Your coats are so beautiful. And I want to learn much more about each of these women. And I cannot wait to see what you bring to the world next. So just thank you so much. This has been an incredible presentation and learning experience. And Teresa, did you have, sorry, I didn't mean to
this was a beautiful presentation. I'm so excited, and I'm so happy to